Hey, kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of Big Hairy News. I was going to say, sorry for being late. I'm not late, but didn't start right on the 10 o'clock, which you normally do. Where are you going? Oi, where are you off to? Get on your mat. Sheesh, trying to walk out on me this early in the morning? Evening, whatever. Sorry. So yeah, I was going to say, sorry for being late. Not really late, but I was just doing one of the saddest things in the world. I was looking for my favorite pen to buy online. Here's a tip for you. If you do a lot of writing, this thing here, it's a Bic. It's called a Bic marking, and it's actually a laundry marker, but it's a really, really good thin tip. You see that? It's probably not going to come up in the camera. And I just thought, oh, what happens is my kids get them, and then they pinch them, and then they don't come back. So this is what I was doing before I came on. I was looking up Bic marking, and I've been looking for them. So yeah, seems a bit sad, I know, but that's what I was doing just before I came on. How are you? You doing well? Having a good time? Having a good week? Welcome back. Good to see you again. Good to be back with you. Just me and Nala tonight, but we've got a lot going on. Tonight's show, in fact, is probably pretty well, it's not really surrounding one subject per se, but it is certainly being influenced heavily by the murder of Janak Patel, the dairy owner, last week. We talked about this a little bit last week towards the end of the week when it happened, and we're talking about it today because, as you guys know, if you join in with what we're doing, is we do always like to go kind of behind the headlines if possible, not meaning to make more of the headlines, but meaning what we try and do is find out if what we're being told in the media is true, is it false, is it accurate, is it exaggerated, is there another perspective, what's going on. And what we're being told at the moment, and it's been heightened for good reason by this murder in Sandringham in Auckland, is that, New Zealand is this turning into this utopia for criminals, and we're all going to be forced to stay inside, and no one's going to be able to walk safely on our streets anymore shortly, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I've done is I've connected, in fact, I'm going to connect with a couple of them this week. Someone later in the week from Victoria University is probably going to come on, and they're going to speak more specifically to the statistics around, fine, go then. Speak more to the statistics around crime in New Zealand at the moment, because we're having one side of the political debate talking about no outcomes from investment. Nationals talking about no outcomes, and the sky is falling. And we're having the other part of politics, really, I guess, Labour, talking about, these things are actually working. And then what we're getting in the media is protests from people saying enough is enough. Literally, those comments were coming out today. And so is it appropriate to be saying, well, when I say is it appropriate, of course it's appropriate to protest any way you want, but is the idea about that we've had enough is enough, meaning this has to end, meaning this has gone down a path of no redemption, is that a fair statement for the whole country? Now, I've said this to you before, sometimes when we talk about crime or individual circumstances, it can sound very cold-hearted and very calculating to then look at the data across the whole country. Sometimes when we talk about, this is what the data is showing us, if a singular individual is suffered at the hands of something, then 100% of that person's experience on that day is terrible. So I always want to make this clear. Anything we talk about tonight that does start to go into the information of what is data across the country saying, what is the trends in the whole country saying, it's not a commentary on what's happened in Sandringham. It's not a commentary on what's happened to individual shop owners getting their shops raided. But it's also unarguable that if there's 20,000 small shops in New Zealand and one of them gets ram raided, that means 19,999 don't. So it's always good to keep a perspective on what the actual events are that are going on, and acknowledge and be empathetic to individual circumstances who are the 100% recipient. So if you are a shop owner and your shop gets ram raided, then 100% of your experience on that day is to be ram raided, even if the data says that's only 1 out of 20,000. And obviously, when then you start talking about people being murdered, that it's not just a ram raid. Increase it 100-fold in the emotive stakes. Rightfully so. I'm not saying increase it in the emotive stakes. Get over. I'm not saying that. I'm saying rightfully so. So when we start to talk about data, it can come across as cold-hearted, and it's not. It's really not. But what I want us to be able to do in all aspects is to be able to see what the media is saying versus what the story is. Do they align? So all of that is to explain a little bit later on tonight. I've already had the conversation today, but a little bit later on tonight, we are going to be having on a criminologist from Otago University to speak more generally about crime in New Zealand and about how the media portrays it. Later on in this week, we're going to get someone on who I spoke to today but was unavailable for a couple of days, who is more the person to break down the stats. What do the stats say? So tonight's show is going to really focus around crime. And it's going to focus around the events of last week and how they've culminated in the last 24 hours. Before we get into all of that, though, I hope you've had a good weekend. I hope you had a safe weekend. I hope everyone's back with us safe and well. I had a very busy weekend building a new deck. There you go. There's a picture of my new deck. As you can see on the right, there is wood from 1960 that I refuse to stand on. I quite literally refuse to stand on it. I stand on I think they call them the nogs, the bracings underneath. That's where I walk. And on the left-hand side, that is the new wood that we ourselves put in over the weekend. But I've also realized that I'm very, very old and very, very broken. So doing that, which is about 5.5 meters of decking times, I think it's 9 boards there, basically took me 2 to 3 hours on Saturday, and took 2 of us actually, and 2 to 3 hours on Sunday. So yes, we are not young and sprightly, and our backs hurt, and etc., etc., etc. as we're going on. But that's what my weekend was basically full of. Good evening to everyone as well who has been joining us. Good evening, JN. Good evening, Rob. Evening, Beards. Good evening to Cy, and good evening to another Cy. The Cy's, Simple and Simon. Simple Simon. Never thought about that before. Something else I wanted to show you, and this is completely off topic, but it was fascinating from this morning. Interesting to see the COVID numbers today. We're at about 27,000. Now, remember last week, the ministry said that's probably only about 35% of cases. So we're still hovering around that 75,000 per week if you extrapolate what they've said. The good thing about that is it hasn't really gone up. It's gone from kind of 22,000 to 24,000 to 27,000, which means if you extrapolate, it's gone from 68,000 to 70,000 to 75,000, which actually is not a massive through the roof. So whilst that still could be 10,000 cases a day, it seems because now, okay, disclaimer, not a medical professional, not giving advice, but it appears that perhaps a previous infection with an Omicron, be that BA4, BA5, one of those, seems to be still quite good protectance of BQ, which is an Omicron. So the people who are now getting it are the people like me who haven't had it. And maybe the reason we're not seeing the massive spike in this surge is it's all the people who haven't had it yet, who are more vulnerable, who are getting it. And so that's actually, well, it's not a good thing if you get it. We always try to avoid it. But if you get it, so be it. It's a virus and it does its own thing. Interesting to see that the case numbers haven't taken off. There's still a spike and it's still rising, but it's nothing like that gradient that we've seen in the past. The story does relate to something else as well. If you haven't seen this yet, it's really interesting. In the middle of this morning's breakfast on TVNZ, there was a change of host. So Matty McLean started the show, and about halfway through the show, he disappeared, and Jack Tame turned up.
No, my hoki minor, welcome back to breakfast. We're just a little bit late.
I'm assuming you can hear that, by the way.
Late for your 7:30 news, and you may be wondering,
come on, internet.
Who this guy is standing next to us. Anyway, thank you for being with us this morning. Jack, at the last minute, you're in a deep sleep apparently.
Yeah.
So
It's my pleasure. It's my
what you were saying
absolute pleasure.
about
the boss
2 minutes
called
ago.
you.
No, like hopefully the pillow marks on my forehead aren't going to be pressed in
Yeah,
too much.
yeah,
Anyway, we
sound.
appreciate the last minutes coming off the bench
Yes,
for Maddie,
thank
your
you.
friend
Thank
who's got
you.
COVID.
Yeah.
Turned up this morning,
Yeah.
got a text from his fiance, who was positive.
Yes.
So Maddie did a test. He was positive.
Yeah.
And
How
they-
crazy is that? So in the
Yeah.
middle of middle of breakfast this morning on TVNZ, Maddie McLean got a call from his partner, who had just tested positive for COVID. So Maddie did a test straight away and tested positive for COVID. So I had to leave. I mean, it must have been, probably good for Maddie. He obviously has a, what do you call it when you don't have any symptoms? Asymptomatic. He's probably asymptomatic. And yes, thank you for confirming, everybody, that we have audio. I actually did something before we started. I played some audio and I went and got my phone and I logged on from my phone from the other room to see if I could hear the audio through the phone through there. So I was fairly confident, but you never really know. You never really know. So that was just a little tidbit of interesting, quote unquote, news from today, that in the middle of this morning's breakfast show, Maddie McLean tested positive for COVID and obviously had to exit straight away. I do hope everyone who's at breakfast is protected. Maybe they've had it. Maybe they're less likely to get it again because they were working with someone this morning who had it, which goes to show it's still around. Right. I think almost all of our video today is from TVNZ. It's purely circumstantial. I think we did this last week, and almost all of our video in one night was from News Hub. It's just I go through and I find the clips and I have a look, and it just happens that this is the case. This morning, TVNZ, I don't know if it was pre or post, Maddie, but hosted the Prime Minister. And remember there was that hubbub last week about the Prime Minister not being in her electorate by David Seymour. And we made the comment, well, if she was in her electorate and she was knocking on doors and she was, being around, she would have got criticized for that as well. If she wasn't there, she was going to get criticized. If she was there, she would have been told she was playing politics. Well, she was at the funeral of Janak Patel over the weekend. And of course, one of the questions is, should you have been there? So it's a no-win situation. If she hadn't have gone to the funeral, the question would have been, why weren't you there? She did go to the funeral. And so she got questioned by TVNZ as to, should you have been there?
Did the family want you there?
I specifically.
I might actually pause all of this just because what I think is happening is I don't know why I did it all just before we started. I'm just going to refresh stuff. It might take me a second longer to find what we're trying to do, but I do have the time codes here, so I know where we're going to go to. We're going to go to 48 seconds, which is right there.
Did the family want you there?
I specifically, I received an invitation.
Yep.
And in receiving that invitation, I always treat funerals as a very private affair. So for me, as a general rule of thumb, I wouldn't usually attend. But given I received the invitation, I then put in just a second check to see if they wanted me present. And so that's why I was in the end there.
Was that the only reason that you went, because you were given that invitation?
No. So it's just, as I say, these are tricky things. I want to be very sensitive to the family. At that time, these are moments for family and for friends, and so I stepped very carefully through that. But it was also in my community. I'm the local MP, so I wanted to make sure that I was doing right by my community, but also by the family. So just carefully stepping your way through that. And it's been that way for me for the last week.
So this is your community. You're quite shocked that this has happened?
You would have heard the head of our Sandringham Business Association speaking. There have been a number of events in the community. Yep. They have been, if I reflect nationwide on some of the statistics we have, when it comes to aggravated robbery, which is when it involves threats of violence and where individuals are present, those have become rarer over the last 5 years. They've about halved for dairies and superettes. But when they do occur, they're incredibly intimidating, frightening for those present. And what we've seen alongside that is just straight burglary. So when someone isn't present, and that's what you define a RAM rate as, that's where we've seen the spike. Yeah. So that's where a lot of the resources being focused. But it can't be at the absence of looking at those smaller number but very, very violent and frightening aggravated robberies as well.
Now you'll appreciate. I'm actually going to just scroll through this manually here because this one is working rather than the other ones that may not be quite so much working. That's for the next bit. You also will appreciate that we were talking last week a couple of times about the idea of this number that's been put out in the media that there's a ram raid every 15 hours. And I said last week, I'm pretty confident in saying that I would be willing to bet dollars to donuts that will not be a statistic that will last through the whole year. I wouldn't be surprised if there was statistical anomaly that says there was a period of time over a weekend, over a week, over a 2-week period where there were lots of ram raids and that number did work. But later on in this conversation, the Prime Minister actually explains what the ram raids are right now, which we're going to get to. Now, the other thing they talked about, and they talked about it in this breakfast interview, but then they also talked about it this evening when there was a release made about what's going to happen with for small businesses, is they talked about fog cannons. And I'll have to be honest with you, I'm sorry if I'm the only one here who doesn't know. I had no idea what a fog cannon was. The Prime Minister talked about fog cannons. The Prime Minister talked about, what has been installed and works. And when we go to the press conference later on in the show that she held this afternoon, we'll understand a bit more about it. But if you were like me, I'm sure you're not. If you were like me and you weren't, and you're not sure what fog cannons are, they're basically they appear to be a distractant for if a business gets robbed, and it's a way to disorientate, I guess you'd say, the perpetrator of the crime and give the person in the establishment either a chance to get away, get out, to move off. That now you're watching on our screen what a fog cannon is. It's literally like a humongous I guess I was thinking fog cannon, the things you have when you're at a dance party, whatever they're called, fog machine. But there you go. So it fills the shop with a fog. Now I'm probably the only one was in the dark, pardon the pun, about this, but that is what a fog cannon is. And in my little bio here, it says fog cannons for everyone. That will be coming up a little bit later on. So that's what a fog cannon is, in case you, like me, had never seen one before. And obviously it's something that fills the room and allows the worker in the room to perhaps get out the back, to leave, to run away, to disorientate the person. Maybe it causes the perpetrator to flee. I'm not sure, but that's what a fog cannon is, in case you, like me, hadn't seen one before. Okay, so the next part of this conversation, the Prime Minister was talking to breakfast about people being concerned that crime is out of control. So the Prime Minister was asked about that and responded thusly.
I hear them. For me, it's my job to hear that, to look at what's happening, what we can see, what's being recorded as happening across the country. And it's, as I say, particular activity at the moment. We have had a spike in particularly ram raids and burglaries for shops. Interestingly, we've seen it come away in other areas. And so you've seen probably what's happened is a heightened attention on this type of crime. That's where we've got to be really make sure that then we're putting in that prevention. And I hear that,
So, I mean, I don't think the Prime Minister's quite saying this, but when she says heightened attention on this kind of crime, I mean, could you lay that at the feet of the David Seymours of this world as well? Like, he's not going around talking about other crime coming down. He's putting a heightened amount of attention on a particular crime going up. And this is where stats and figures, I think, are so important about overall crime. So a heightened amount of focus on this crime doesn't mean it's inappropriate for the government to be focused on sorting out that crime, or the police. But I guess if you're looking as an opposition to score points, does a heightened amount of attention on that crime, is it honest? Are you an honest actor where it may be in other areas of crime it's coming down? I don't know.
So what more can we do to reach those who need that extra access to crime prevention? How do we stop repeat offences? We've had a program, for instance, where we've recognised that there have been young people particularly involved in ram raids. We think about 70 are at the core hard end of these offences and repeatedly involved, and in some cases as young as 12 and 13. The justice system for 12 and 13-year-olds, the thresholds are very high for court. So we've worked on programs to try and get in there. And
it's really important to hear what the PM's saying. If the threshold is very high in the justice system, that's not a Labour legislation. So when the rhetoric comes from the community or from the opposition saying that Labor's soft on crime, these people are committing crimes, they're just getting away from it. And I think I heard the Prime Minister say in a conversation yesterday, no laws have been changed. The threshold is high to charge a 12-year-old with a crime. Maybe it would be fair to say the government should change the threshold, but it's the same threshold that was there under a national government, that was there under other iterations of governments as well. Nothing's changed in the law. The threshold has always been and continues to be high.
Work with their families as well, because obviously if you're a 12 and 13-year-old and you're engaging in that, there are other problems. Roughly half of those we've managed to re-engage in education and training, and we've brought the reoffending rate down. We know that that's making a difference. How can we spread the impact?
That's making a difference over time, though, right?
It's been a relatively short period of time that we've managed to do that, but we need further reach, we need wider reach, we need other geographic areas, because it's been tamaki makaurau.
Is there anything?
There you go. There's a second clip for you as well. The third clip that we're going to play from this morning is the conversation, and this comes up by chance when we're talking to the criminologist about immediate change. We want immediate change. The problem with systemic issues, or the problems with issues around crime that have underlying other issues, is it's very hard to get an immediate change. But we as society, we see a spike in an area, let's say ram raids, and we want to see it stopped or changed immediately. It's not always as easy to do that as we would want to see happen.
The first thing is ram raids have started coming down. Last I checked, there were about 13 this month. The reason for that is because prosecutions. We put an extra 500 million in the last budget to police, and they've got 1,600 extra police officers. They are resourced now to be prosecuting, and that's what they're doing, and that is making a difference. So that's one of the reasons they're coming down. So we will continue to see the impact of that. The other thing we can do is continue to look at those crime prevention initiatives that help the store owner feel safe in their own workplace. So we can pick up the pace. So I hope and spread of those. It's one of the things we'll consider today at Cabinet. Finally, you would have heard the Business Association talk about community safety measures, lighting, CCTV. Council is one of the lever holders there, so we want to work closely with them again. Cabinet will talk about that today. So I do believe that there are other things we can do, and we will continue to just make sure we move as quickly as we can.
There is another thing to add to this conversation, and the other thing to add to this conversation is that, and the Prime Minister didn't mention it there, but I think she mentioned it in her press conference, and we're going to play a little bit later on, is that it was a ram raid every 15 hours. That's the number that's been bandied around tonight. And if you were with us last week, you'll appreciate it. I said a couple of times, I bet my house on the fact that it's not going to be a ram raid every 15 hours for the whole year or for a huge period of time. There'll be a portion. Prime Minister said today, and does say again, that so far this, well, I guess unless something's happened tonight, but so far this month, as of this afternoon, so far this month, that's 28 days, there's been 13 ram raids. So that's now one every 2 days, so one every 48 hours. And I guess what the Prime Minister is saying is that, albeit every individual ram raid is going to be difficult and problematic for that situation and that shop owner, that the data across all of it says it's coming down. Now, yeah, we'll leave it at that and play the last little bit. The other thing, and I'm not sure where the comment came from, but I genuinely don't know where it came from, but there was a headline today about either the Prime Minister or the Labour Party being quote unquote pro-criminal, and they wrap up this conversation with the Prime Minister pushing back pretty hard on that.
The accusation that we are pro-criminal, I push back on. You will not find a decrease in any of the penalties in any of the criminal areas that we've been discussing today. We have not lessened. We have increased the resourcing for police. We have increased the impetus to hold people accountable in that regard. So I understand people are grieving. They want action. I hear that. We will keep doing what we can. But to be accused of being pro-criminal, I will push hard against that.
And just finally, that
was a push hard against that. Yeah, there's more to share on this. So that was this morning, and then we go through the day, and I think what we're going to do now is have a look at what happened this evening. So this afternoon, there was protests around New Zealand. There was protests at outside the Prime Minister's office. There was protests outside other places, Labour MP offices, etc. And obviously this is the one in Sandringham, this is the one in Mount Albert, which is the most heightened at the moment for the correct reasons, obviously, because of the murder that happened last week. So let's have a look at the news from today. So that was breakfast time. This is evening time. In between those two times, there's also been an announcement of funding for small businesses. And we'll catch up with that after we've checked out the main story from TVNZ tonight about the protests. And I've again, being very clear, walking gently about how we ask these questions, because some of the people in this protest are protesting because someone in their community has just been murdered, right? Walking gently and acknowledging empathetically their loss, it's still appropriate to look at the overall questions that are being asked about crime and what the data says. So we'll have a look at that. Here's a TVNZ news story about the protest outside the PM's office.
Enough is enough, shopkeepers across the country chanted today, the government responding with millions more for security measures. Emotions ran high as dairy owners took action over safety and to honour slain worker Janak Patel. All small shops and dairies in New Zealand will now be eligible for a subsidised fog cannon. More details of other safety measures shortly. First, though, Jacob Johnson was there as vocal protesters descended on Jacinda Ardern's electorate office.
Frustration and fear. This protest spilling onto the streets of Mount Albert.
So this is one of the questions I wanted to ask. Again, walking gently. They are chanting change the law. Prime Minister has just said no laws have been changed under them to make anything different. Now, if what the group is doing is saying the laws that have been in place for the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years are not appropriate, we need harsh penalties. Fine. Sell that argument. But what it feels like is that they're saying change the law as in incumbent government, you guys have messed it up, fix it. Whereas I guess what Labour is saying, what the Prime Minister is saying is no laws have been changed. No legislations have been changed. No sentencing conditions have been changed. So there have been no laws changed to cause this. Now let's have a conversation around changing laws, I don't know, to make penalties harsher. I'm not sure what the result would be, but just making it clear that the chant of change the law, I'm a bit lost as to what they're asking for. Are they asking for new laws, or are they asserting that Labour's done something to the law which hasn't happened?
Dairy and small business workers demanding their voices be heard after the murder of dairy worker Janak Patel.
Is New Zealand a safe place for small business retail? I don't think so. Not right now.
We shouldn't have to live in fear. We're Kiwi Indians. We pay our part in the community. We shouldn't have to be scared every single day.
Hundreds have gathered here outside the Prime Minister's electorate office in Auckland to pay tribute to Janak Patel and call for action. Many business owners I've spoken to say their business has been hit several times.
2 weeks ago today, we were the victims at 4:30 in the afternoon of a violent robbery in our jewellery shop.
Gun on the head, 2 or 3 times, big knife, people come with the knife.
The Prime Minister today acknowledging these workers' fears.
This is about the safety of community. This is about the ability of people to go to work and feel safe. I absolutely understand the strength of feeling around that.
Police forced to block off the road and calm the crowd.
And I understand their frustration, but they're generally a very law-abiding community.
The investigation into last week's murder at the Rose Cottage Superette is ongoing. 2 men appeared in court today charged with robbery in relation to the incident. They've been remanded in custody and will reappear alongside the murder accused next month. Police now searching for the knife used to kill Janak Patel and the drawer from the till that was taken. It's also been revealed the murder accused was being managed by corrections after being imprisoned overseas. A full review is now underway. A funeral was held for Janak Patel last night. His loss still felt by the business community today.
It's very sad.
Unfortunately, it has taken that to get us all on board here today.
Their calls loud and clear. Jacob Johnson.
So there you go. There's the next part of the story. Yeah, it's a horrible, tragic, shocking disgusting story. Yep. But that's where we're at right now. You can take them. Thanks, mate. So the Prime Minister has come out giving out more information about what they're going to do. Not how do I word this? What the Labor government has now done is offered funding and help to small businesses. Some are going to argue too little, too late. I would just pose a question, and look, I'll be frank, maybe this is an inappropriate question. Under a national government that believes in the responsibility of the individual and business, they're not the government, they're not traditionally governments of funding help, etc. What would be happening? I don't know. The press conference today that the Prime Minister came out after cabinet meeting, that there is some really interesting and different tone from the Prime Minister. There was 2 or 3 times in this conversation where the Prime Minister had absolutely direct jabs at National. Now, is it appropriate or not? I'm not sure. To be really honest with you, I kind of think the idea of pushing hard politically in this situation feels a bit grubby, but it's exactly what National and ACT are doing at the moment. So part of me also kind of goes, well, the Prime Minister's pushing back. There are some really clear statements made within this press conference. I'm just going to play you 2 short clips from it, specifically talking about what happened under National. So here's an example. I don't know if they talk about it in this, but I'll give you an example. The dairy where the murder happened in Sandringham, they applied for a fog cannon under National and got declined. So how much of the responsibility rides with the previous government, who actually declined this dairy a fog cannon for their own protection, that then led to this? The other thing to ask is the 501 deportees. Now, if you're not quite clear what that is, basically, if you were born in New Zealand, go to Australia when you're 3 weeks old, 5 weeks old, 2 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, whatever, but you're born in New Zealand, and then you commit a crime in America, then what happens is you spend time in jail in Australia. Then when you come out, they put you on a plane home. Not all the time, but often the 501 deportees are people who have grown up in Australia, are a product of Australia, have a criminal past thanks to Australia, and then they get shipped back to New Zealand with no connections, no community, no chances of work. Now, I'm not just blaming Australia for that, because I think we kind of do the same, but it's a huge question about who is responsible for that criminal behavior if you've been in Australia since you were 2 years old. In other words, if they've come up in your society, right, and they're a product of Australia, and we don't know the details of this person, but this has happened before, and then you ship them back to New Zealand after they've done jail time, then what? And it looks like the then what in this instance is one of the most tragic outcomes you could possibly have. So here's the press conference featuring the Prime Minister this afternoon. The first thing she did talk about was funding for fog cannons. Well, it wasn't the first thing, sorry. The first thing we're going to play was talking about funding for fog cannons, etc., etc. I have a listen to what was said today, because you don't get the full conversation on the news. You get a 12-second clip of this. So let's have a listen to a bit more of it.
In 2018, we stepped up our investment in aggravated robbery prevention initiatives, which resulted in the rollout of over 1,000 fog cannons. Previously, the initiative set up by the last government, following an increase in aggravated robberies in 2016, had a much more narrow scope. We know these installations have made a difference, but in that time, we've now seen ram raids increase. In May, we established a $6 million crime prevention fund managed by police to install bollards or other protection structures in front of businesses being targeted by ram raids. More than 100 shops have had installations approved, with 431 security measures underway, including 93 fog cannons, 78 security sirens, 57 alarms, 63 CCTV systems, 43 sets of bollards, and 36 roller doors. At the same time, we also see a concerted effort by police to bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice, and that is having an impact. This year, there have been 517 ram raids. In response, there have been 360 prosecutions and 145 youth referrals. This will in part one of the reasons why, so far this month, we've seen a decrease.
Just on that point, and sorry to break it just there when she's about to talk about decrease, just on that point about the convictions, that in and of itself, even though they're not saying there's a 100% conviction rate, that in and of itself demolishes any of this narrative that there's no consequences for the actions of these people. Because in the ram raids, there have been arrests and there have been convictions. Therefore, for some of the participants, there have been consequences. So even if it's some, the idea of there's no consequences, which you're hearing quite a lot at the moment, is statistically incorrect.
Structures in front of businesses being targeted by ram raids. More than 100 shops have had installations approved, with 431 security measures underway, including 93 fog cannons, 78 security sirens, 57 alarms, 63 CCTV systems, 43 sets of bollards, and 36 roller doors. At the same time, we also see a concerted effort by police to bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice, and that is having an impact. This year, there have been 517 ram raids. In response, there have been 360 prosecutions and 145 youth referrals. This will in part one of the reasons why, so far this month, we've seen a decrease in ram raids from the high point in August to 13 this month thus far. But over the last few weeks, Cabinet has been looking at how we can better support businesses and has signed off today an additional package to continue to tackle retail crime. This includes 1, a new $4 million fund to support local council crime prevention programs to be matched dollar for dollar with councils themselves. 2, expanding the $6 million retail crime prevention fund to include aggravated robberies committed during the past 12 months. 3, a $4,000 subsidy for all small shops and dairies to install a fog cannon if they choose, not just those who have been the victim of a crime.
So there you go. So there's a lot of stuff coming out from this, and there is a lot of initiatives being put forward. Now, look, the pessimist out there will say too little, too late. People are talking in the chat now about the police are the people who declined the request from the fog cannon. However, I guess my statement was under national. So my statement was under the national government, they had their fog cannon declined. Labor's come out today trying to fix a bunch of things, I guess. Too little, too late. I guess that's your perspective to call on. We also we start this next clip with the Prime Minister talking about constraints. The constraints, so you know, because I'm not playing this, but are on the fog cannons getting to us. Supply chain issues at the moment, but they're going to be on the way. And then she talks about how statistically speaking, again, what they're doing is working. Now, you just heard that there's 500 ram raids. There's been, what did they say? Like 300 odd arrests and 150 odd referrals to youth courts. That's over 400. So over 400 people have been within the justice system because of that. Labor is claiming that because of that, this month there's been a ram raid every 2 days rather than a ram raid every 15 hours, which is the number that the National Party wants to throw around at the moment. But that's also, I want to play this bit as well, because this is the bit, and look, we'll get to your comments about, you know, when I said it feels a bit grubby having the kind of playing the politics around this. I actually agree with all the people in the comments who are saying, no, it's appropriate. I agree with that as well. But I guess what I'm saying is that I'd rather that no one had to do it. Like, I'd rather the opposition didn't do it either, but I'm just being a bit naive perhaps. And you'll hear the Prime Minister kind of pushing back pretty hard about what happened under the previous national government as well. So we start off with the constraints around fog cannons getting here. She talks about what they're doing is working. That's what her perspective, and bit of a jab at national. So here you go.
Revise that these constraints are in part due to the global demand for fog cannons. It appears that New Zealand is not alone in the current experience we are having. Finally, we also continue with the work we are doing with young offenders and their families. Evidence shows that what we are doing is working, with around half of the most serious and repeat young offenders that were identified and targeted through the Better Pathways package now back in education or training. Reoffending amongst this cohort has also reduced. As ministers, we've also gone over all the tools available to deal with young offenders in these areas. There are many, including the use of the courts. We're concerned by reports that not all of these tools are being accessed where the public might expect, and continue to actively look at ways to resolve this issue. To conclude, the extra initiatives we're announcing today make up the most significant crime prevention financial package in recent memory. But one of the most important things we can also do is to continue to support the police. We've grown our police force to its largest level in our country's history, with over 1,600 police over and above attrition, added since 2017, a turnaround from the declining numbers we inherited. Every year since taking office, we've also increased the policing budget, including by a record 16% in the 2019-2020 year. This compares to 2 years of frozen budgets under National and other years that saw increases between just 1% and 2%. We must continue to ensure that any debate on crime is based on fact, evidence, investment, and change. I am committed to that.
It was pretty tame. I mean, don't get me wrong. It was a pretty tame jab, but it was, I think I guess the reason I wanted to bring it to our attention is I think it's the first time I've heard the Prime Minister actually push back at all, and specifically push back about what they inherited. So I found it interesting. Right. We're going to jump in and have a conversation with a criminologist very shortly, but before we do, a ton of you in the chat going for it. So let's have a look at some of the comments that have been coming in. These will be comments anywhere from the start of the show through to now. Although I noticed no one made any comments about my new deck. Gary says, anyone seen any MPs admitting that police wasting time and resources arresting users of prohibited substances interferes with the policy ability to protect people from real danger and harm? Simon says, previous national government closed 30 police stations. It's funny, my one of the things with my dyslexia, sometimes it kicks in and my eyes flicker and I can't quite read it. I thought it was petrol station. Maybe I did that too. Bradley says it all comes from poverty. I think that's more to do with the reasons behind what we've been talking about. Kim says if National were being honest, they would acknowledge that boot camps were a waste of money. I think that will be proven. That'll prove itself yet again if it ever does happen. Sai says overall crime is down, but media is still blowing up ram raids. Ben, have many of these dairies stopped selling cigs? I don't know. Bradley says our murder charges is pretty damn weak, to be honest. And look, I mean, if the conversation is our justice system needs reform, maybe you think it needs to be harsher penalties, maybe you think it needs to be more restorative, whatever. It's a fair conversation to have. My gut tells me those protests in the street are blaming the incumbent government for what's been going on. That's a different conversation. So yeah. Another one here from Sai. It's a shame that a man has lost his life and the assailant is responsible for the outcome. However, the shop owner followed the assailant, which resulted in his death. Your life is worth more than items. I don't think that's necessarily a conversation we're going to get into. I mean, there but for the grace of God, go any of us, I remember working at a petrol station in Beach Road, downtown Auckland, and some dude ran in and grabbed a bag of chips and ran out, and I took off down the street after him because it was my job to look after the store, and there but for the grace of God, who knows. National only funded 50% of 2017 fog cannons. And this is where people are saying pushing back. She's not pushing back. She's clarifying misinformation peddled by National. Jay also says National politicised this tragedy within seconds of it happening. I agree. Kookie says, why not issue dairy owners with pepper spray as well? Pretty sure it's illegal in New Zealand, isn't it, pepper spray? I'm pretty sure it is. I mean, but that's probably a part of the conversation. I mean, I'm not saying I think it's appropriate or we want to go there, but, arming dairy owners. What does that mean? I don't know. I'm not suggesting it's a good idea, certainly not for firearms, but I mean, dairy owners out there, do they have baseball bats behind the counters? Do they do it? Do they look after themselves that way? I don't know. These are all questions to be put out there. What will National's response be? Why are you soft on crime, Prime Minister? Yeah, I guess that's based on all those facts and figures we just get. A couple more texts that are coming in. Instead, opposition use everything to bash Ardern. This is just the hottest, latest ticket. Yep. Yeah, I think that's what we'll do for now. There are more comments in there. I obviously just can't get to everybody's all the time. What we're going to do now is we're going to be joined by, well, it's a pre-record, but we're going to be joined by Dr. Fairleigh Gilmore. Dr. Fairleigh Gilmore is a senior lecturer in criminology. Because what I always want to do is then talk about what's under the headlines. Like, and I'll be honest, I want these conversations to be, is the crime stats and facts and figures, and this is not necessarily a crime stats conversation with Fairleigh, it's more crime trends, what we're seeing in the media at the moment. Later on this week, we are going to be having a guest on, an academic on, to talk about the stats. But what is it? Is what we're being told true? Are we a much more dangerous country today than we used to be, or not? And that's the genesis of the conversation. We'll rip into it. I hate saying this out loud, because when I say this out loud and it works, people who are just joining us for the first time like us are like, oh, what are you talking about the sound for? I'm assuming the sound's going to work because everything's worked so far, and I tested it before we came on. But if for some reason you don't hear what you're supposed to hear, get into the chat super quick and I will fix it. But as for right now, here is criminologist Dr. Fairleigh Gilmore on a conversation that I had with her this afternoon about crime in New Zealand today. From Sociology, Gender Studies and Criminology at Otago University, Dr. Fairleigh Gilmore joins us. Fairleigh, thank you so much for giving us some time today.
Kia ora, Pat, no worries.
Kia ora. Hey, I want to talk a bit about crime. You are somebody who is a senior lecturer in criminology and gender studies, but we've got you primarily to talk about criminology today. And one of the things I got off your bio, which I think is part of this conversation, is the media representations of crime. I often use this example from Bowling for Columbine, when Michael Moore is talking to I think an academic in South Central Los Angeles about how violent crime is going down in Los Angeles, but the media coverage of violent crime has gone up by 600%. So it means the people in that area feel like we're living in a much more dangerous time, and statistically they weren't. Now, I'm not putting that out there to kind of preface this conversation like it's the same thing. I don't know, but I'm always aware that what we feel and what we're being told is not necessarily representative in the data or representative in what's going on in the trends in the country. So that's sort of what we want to have a look at and talk about. And the reason we want to talk about it is obviously there is a big conversation in the marketplace at the moment, the public square, about crime in New Zealand. We are being told by some politicians and by the media that crime's out of control and crime's gone crazy. I've just did a bit of searching around and found a little comment to give an indication of this, where Mr. Luxon, leader of the opposition, was saying we can't have kumbaya and a lot of mush and no action and no improved outcomes. So he's saying, so National's saying there's no improved outcomes when it comes to crime. We have to have consequences alongside it. The Dairy and Business Association is on board with the idea. This is from the Dairy and Business Association. I see the value. The offenders must know that they'll be caught and there'll be consequences. So the vibe out there is criminals aren't getting caught. There's no consequences. There's no outcomes to what the current government's doing. And this is my addendum, is that, and crime's worse than it's ever been. I think there would be a fair summation of what we're getting through the media at the moment. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the vibe I'm hearing and feeling. It would be good to hear from you and maybe speak to that as to what you're seeing and what you're understanding from your position as a senior lecturer in criminology.
Sure. So just to contextualize this a little bit, in most of like the Western English-speaking democracies, we've seen crime, particularly serious violent crime, steadily declining since about the early 90s. Yet in all those countries, we also see this massive escalation of media reporting on violence, on crime, often decontextualizing it, often in ways that's really fear-mongering. And we see a lot of it in the lead up to elections. Obviously, you can probably read from my accent, I'm Australian, and we do the same thing in Australia. That's something that I studied when I was living there, and we see the same thing happening here. Now, that's not to say that there isn't serious crime occurring, including some really serious incidents recently, which people are rightly going to be really distressed about and grieving. But to position that as though we're just seeing this massive increase in crime over time, it's not accurate in terms of what the statistics show us.
I spoke to an American academic, no, sorry, not academic, journalist. Well, he's an academic, last week in another one of the podcasts I did, and his job now is to have communication, and he teaches people how to communicate. And he says the first thing you do is the message you have to give has to speak to the heart, and then from there you can fill up the rest of the message with facts and figures. It seems that what we're finding at the moment is the message to the heart is about the families of victims and the victims themselves, which is the appropriate thing to do, empathy and concern for these people. So it's speaking to our hearts. And it's always kind of difficult to have a conversation when, for example, the Sandringham Dairy murder is basically yesterday, it feels like it's only just happened, which it has. But then to come away from it and need to be somewhat sterile to talk about the trends over the whole country, because the trends over the whole country don't necessarily reflect how the community of Sandringham's feeling right now. But it is important to talk of the trends. And I mean, do you have any information? Do you know what the trends are showing us right now? Is it worse than it's ever been? Is it still trending down? Like, as an example, we've just watched a video before we spoke to you with the Prime Minister talking, and she said in that interview that in the past 28 days, there's been 13 ram raids. Now, that's still 13 too many. No one questions that. But National's still going around saying a ram raid every 15 hours, because at one stage there was, for a period of time, a ram raid every 15 hours. Now it's a ram raid every 2 days. What do you see in the trends? What do we need to know to look at it, take a step back and look at the whole conversation rather than the appropriate empathetic outcome to an individual situation?
I think you kind of raised some things which I think it's really important to consider when we're answering questions like this, because I do worry sometimes that my answers are going to sound reasonably sterile, because from a mathematical sense, what we tend to see is the crime rate kind of wobbling downwards. So occasionally there will be spikes, and there often will be spikes about a specific thing. We'll have a lot of ram raids at some point, or a lot of dairy robberies at some point. Often, we can see that there are social forces or other forces impacting on some of the spikes, particularly things like, high youth unemployment, social unrest around specific times. Particularly, we've just been through a pandemic, which has raised stress. A lot of people have lost jobs. A lot of people are struggling to get jobs, and that can impact on crime rates. Mm-hmm. Overall, we're seeing it tends to be like a wobbly line downwards. So just comparing, say, this year to last year, or this month to last month, mathematically is not going to track really well what we're actually seeing as a community. I think one of the really important things to talk about, though, because, of any really violent crimes like that, just one is too many. It's really distressing to hear that happening. As a criminologist, our job tends to be, though, not to really talk about how we might all feel about that, but actually how do we stop it happening? And unfortunately, those sorts of answers tend to be quite long-term. If you look at our prison population, you tend to see very high rates of childhood abuse, living in poverty, early exclusion from school, parents not having support particularly around drugs and alcohol and mental illness. So if you want to intervene and stop serious criminal behaviour, it has to be a long-term project. Unfortunately, when we're very distressed, we want an immediate answer. We want something that's going to fix this right now, even if it's not evidence-based, even if we're not able to show that it will reduce victimhood in the future.
Yeah, and that's kind of speaking to the heart thing, isn't it? It's like, I mean, if you're the victim of a crime, then that says 100% of my experiences today was around criminal activity. Whereas I think I said the other night on the show, if you look at ram raids, for example, the media doesn't report by the way of the 10,000 dairies around New Zealand or shops around New Zealand, 9,999 of them weren't ram raided last night. They report about the one that was. What about your expertise or your area of interest or area of lecturing to do with the media representation of crime and how it's talking about it at the moment? Got anything to speak to when it comes to that?
Yeah, definitely. So there is, we often see right before elections, around election time, a really clear focus by political parties on law and order responses to crime. And often there's often a positioning of one party as soft on crime and the other one will crack down. They're going to come and intervene. Usually the things that they are presenting as the correct interventions are not evidence-based, and that we don't have any way to show that they'll prevent crime in any way, even though they've been, used in the past. But they do tend to speak to people's immediate kind of want for vengeance and but also this kind of like, let's do something now. I think it's really important when we're looking at criminal justice to not think that doing anything is better than doing nothing, because we actually know that some quite heavy criminal justice interventions, particularly early in people's lives, mean they're more likely to reoffend, which means there's more likely to be more victims in the future. I think we like to just tell ourselves, well, doing anything's better, but that's actually not true if it means more people are being victimized and suffering. So the way in which we talk about crime is really important. In the boring mathematical sense, we actually have to talk about crime rates, not numbers. And we have to talk, otherwise we're comparing apples and oranges because we have a growing population. Doesn't make sense. But we also have to look at a longer trajectory over time. Otherwise we're being mathematically lazy and we're not really capturing the picture. Often we even talk about specific crimes that aren't clearly recorded because they're not a specific crime category. And then we're saying, oh, there's this massive spike in this, but actually it's not something that's clearly enumerated by our criminal justice forces. So there's many ways in which even just the way we use numbers, we should be a lot more careful, but also the way we talk about crime is really important. If we're just talking about cracking down on people, ignoring the fact that a lot of people involved in these things are quite vulnerable and marginalized, we're creating a really us and them discourse, which it's not just probably a little unfair, it's ineffective because we're not going to come up with the answers to fix the problem. And that should be our goal, fixing the issue and preventing further victimization.
Yeah, the fixing the issue one's an interesting point as well. Just going back to that comment I read about from the Dairy and Business Association spokesperson saying that the offenders must know that they'll be caught. And I mean, I'm like, at what stage in our life or our history or in the future will there ever be a guarantee that people will be getting caught, will face consequences, because sometimes people get away with crime as well. You know what I mean? It's like, where is also our realistic expectation of what crime is? I thought the other day, as I was thinking about trying to talk about this tonight, I kind of thought how much of the current government is responsible for what's going on, and let's just say ram raids. Like, how much are they responsible for it? Is it all of it? Is it some of it? Is it none of it? And I just thought, this is not because it's the opposing party, but are we kind of blaming, we being society, blaming Labour for the ram raids? Is that akin to us blaming National for the Christchurch earthquake? In other words, it was something that happened on their watch, but they had no control over. Is the ram raid something that's happening on Labour's watch that they've got no control over, or do they have some culpability, if not for the action, for the reaction that hasn't hit yet?
I think in line with what I was kind of saying before, if we look at who we incarcerate in New Zealand, they're primarily people who experienced quite extreme marginalisation very young. So I think to then blame any specific issue on the current government in power is decontextualising where problems start. I do think, obviously, high rates of youth unemployment, not having, things for young people to do, addressing child poverty. These are issues that you want to see any government in power addressing, and which will impact on the crime rate. But mostly this has to be a long-term game. And I think it's really unfortunate that the discourse in New Zealand does not see it as a long-term issue, as something that we have to address over time to keep our communities safe.
And I guess you said the discourse in New Zealand, that would probably be the discourse around the world, because like you're saying, you've seen this in Australia, and I'm sure every country in the world, as it comes up to an election, wants answers today and now, and then they don't get them. So it's I'm assuming it's probably a worldwide Western issue that they all need sort of the long game, but everyone wants the short game response.
Yeah, look, there are some quite stark differences between how, say, the English-speaking countries and the Northern European countries have approached these issues, particularly in terms of how the media have framed, particularly youth crime, as, you know, these young bad people versus how do we address this as a community. And we really see that both in terms of how the Northern European countries have dealt more effectively with these issues, have not over-incarcerated young people, and actually have lower rates of these sorts of crimes. So it's not the only path, the one we're on, but yeah, it does seem to be quite dominant in countries like ourselves, Australia, the US.
Do you find from your experience, even between countries, Australia and New Zealand, that the New Zealand media has quite a good handle on fair and accurate representation when it comes to crime? Or is it blown out of proportion? Does the media have a hand to play in this as well?
I think media definitely have a hand to play. I think even, you know, really responsible use of statistics would be a great start. And contextualizing crime a little more in terms of what we know are the causative factors, which is not just young people being bad. Like, there's a lot more going on in these situations. Having said that, like I mentioned, I moved here from Australia, and I guess the comparison is going to be positive. I think there is more effort in media to address things in a sober and thoughtful way, and to talk to experts rather than to ignore them entirely.
What I hear you saying is Rupert Murdoch doesn't have his foothold in New Zealand media, so that's probably why. Oh, you didn't say that, but that's sort of what I thought when you
Exactly
said it.
what I was implying.
The other thing about contextualizing as well, because I watch the media a lot, obviously, and what I don't feel. So there's two ways the media can impact this, I guess, and one is they can be purposely deceptive, like it's a part of their MO, it's a part of what they're doing, or they can just allow things to go, water off a duck's back, no pushback, no nothing. I wonder and feel that in most cases in New Zealand, there's more, giving wrong messages, not necessarily just crime, but any kind of message, the amplification with no pushback, and that speaks to me of a media that needs to do their job better.
I agree, and I do think it's around crime and criminal justice. I think the failure to give pushback against messages which can be shown to be inaccurate is particularly apparent, and I think that's because people are so emotional about crime, and it feels, and for good reason, because people have been victimized and we empathize with them and we feel for the victims and their families. But therefore, it almost seems to give a lot of people a free pass to therefore make claims like harsher sentences, lower crime, which are like provably false, and you would struggle to find a criminological expert to come on your show and even give vague support for that. But no one pushes back on it in the discourse, because it almost sounds like you're not sympathetic, when actually you're just trying to talk about the factual evidence that we currently have about what does and does not work.
So when we hear an opposition talking about boot camps and all that kind of stuff being hard on crime, I mean, to be honest, to be fair, I guess the interviews I saw around that with Mr. Luxon, there was a bit of, but this has been tried before, but not really delving very deeply into it to see why it wouldn't work. It's just sort of a passing comment.
So I think some people or some of us have a kind of just assumption that if we punish something more severely, people will do it less. And we just don't have an evidence basis for that. For example, America has the harshest punishment system in the world, the highest incarceration rate, they have the death penalty. But no one thinks, gee, the US is very safe and they really fixed that crime problem right up. So I just think we need to step back one moment and be like, well, clearly there's not this clear link that we like to think exists with these harsh punishments. Even if we think about how we would parent well, and a lot of the people we're talking about are still very young who we're talking about punishing, good parenting is not about just the harshest, most severe punishment, particularly for people often who have already been traumatized, marginalized, excluded in a variety of ways. So we have to, I think, just push back against this idea that harsher punishment will reduce crime, because I think it's emotionally satisfying and provably wrong.
Mm.
And I think that our criminal justice policy should be about what works, not what feels good sometimes.
Yeah, that feeling word has come up quite a lot recently. People are saying, I feel like I'm unsafe. You know, you see the clip for the B-roll on the news saying, oh, you know, I feel like XYZ. The feeling word comes up a lot. I was just going to say as well, I haven't done it recently, but probably a decade ago, I did quite a lot of research on the US justice system and looked at, for example, the states with the harshest penalties, death penalty. They weren't all the ones at the bottom of the list for crimes committed. They were up the top. So even just anecdotally, with any kind of academic look at it, going, where is the worst murder rates? Where are the death penalties? Those ones kind of lined up to being the ones you would expect it if the death penalty was a punishment to stop crime. That the death penalty states would be the ones at the bottom, and they're not. They're the ones for the most crime up and near the top. So yeah, I know what you're saying.
So I just have to let my dog in.
Sure. Oh, we love dogs.
Come in then. You're going to cry outside.
What kind of dog have you got?
I have a hunter weight called Clyde.
A barky dog. Yeah, my dog's sitting in the studio with me just over there, a little border collie. So we welcome dogs into the conversations. But speaking of, look, if I feel like we've kind of come to the end of this naturally, but is there anything else you'd like to leave us with? Like, I mean, I guess the overall vibe of this conversation was going to be, what are we, you know, are we getting a fair and accurate representation on where crime is today within the media, and I guess from the political parties that are not the government? What would you say to that general statement?
I think the media could do a better job at taking a broader perspective and looking a little more at what our evidence base does say about crime prevention and responses to crime. I do think it's often like a tactical approach in the lead up to an election for opposition parties to have this kind of law and order idea that plays into people's fears, but that doesn't actually offer solutions that will make us safer. And I think as a community, it's better if we're more cohesive and supportive of each other. And I think that kind of playing into a politics of fear is ungenerous to New Zealanders and their, way of perceiving each other. And I don't think it really reflects our best. So I guess it would be nice to see a more honest, evidence-based discussion about crime that really focuses on what does work and how can we implement those solutions in a way that keeps our community safe.
Fantastic. From the University of Otago, Dr. Fairleigh Gilmore. Fairleigh, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm excited we met your dog as well.
Thanks, Pat.
We didn't actually meet the dog, did we? The dog stayed distant. As is mine. I'm pretty upset about this. Look at her. See, you know why? Because the kids are home. When the kids get here, the dog does disappear. All right, some comments that have come in through that conversation. Peter says, lowest prison muster presently 8,000, down from 11,000 3 years ago, an indicator of lower crime or soft on crime. Well, that's an interesting question, Peter. Like, oh gosh, I'm going to say Seymour, but I don't know. One of those right-wing white men talking about they're just opening the doors and letting them out. So, as I guess you're indicating, Peter, some people will look at 8,000 down from 11,000 thinking, good, we're sorting out the justice system. Other people will be saying, well, they're letting out people that should be locked up. So again, there's probably, from a narrative from the outside looking in, there might not be a solution to that. We need people like Dr. Gilmore to delve into the numbers for us and tell us how that actually works. Ben says the latest Jon Stewart episode covered it off nicely. The right pick crime as a target emotive issue and then drum up fear around it. It then becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of fear and disinformation. All right. And JN, just on that conversation, says the good doctor makes sense. Thanks so much. All right, team. Hey, well, it's been a kind of not quite a singularly focused conversation, but certainly it's been a conversation around one main theme tonight. And we will continue this conversation, obviously, because it's an important conversation to be having. As always, we want to give you all of the information that we can. Rob says Dr. Gilmore's comments on media using statistics more responsibly and providing context is applicable to almost all stories BHN covers. Yeah, I guess so. Us as well, eh? We always try our best to be right. I think the difference with us and maybe the mainstream media, other than the checks, is that we've got longer. I mean, I was watching TVNZ this morning. We're watching it afterwards on demand. And at 8 minutes, they're saying to the Prime Minister, "Oh, we've kept you too long. Oh, we've got to go. I'm sorry, we kept you longer than we should." And I'm like, dude, I just don't know how you'd get into anything. The other thing about pushing back is you got to know your shit to push back. I mean, if a politician or a guest or whatever says something, and you're not entirely sure whether it's accurate, inaccurate, a stretch, if you don't really know in the innermost details what it is, then a live interview, most of the time you can't do a lot. I mean, unless you're really well prepped or really know your shit, sometimes those live interviews are what they are. But I guess the responsibility is then to follow that up and then go, well, this was said then, and here's the response to it. We didn't do it at the moment because we didn't have this at our fingertips, but here's the response to it. They don't seem to do that so much. I mean, when we had Chantal Baker on, that's exactly what we did. She threw out all the stuff, and there wasn't time to fact check her live in the process, so we did it later. We said, this is what she said. Here's the actual truth. Here's the actual truth. And I think that's from being someone who's been involved in live radio primarily, doing live interviews. If I was going to say a powerful person, I don't mean they have power over me. I mean, someone with conviction and power and who's eloquent and who has data at their fingertips says a fact or a figure. If you don't have the ability to fact check it there and then, you can't fact check it there and then. But it's probably incumbent on the media to then go back and check that. And I think I like when you see a live interview like in Breakfast or in the AM show that then gets reflected that night in the 6 p.m. show, where they can then do some pushback. Should it be requiring that they do that? If they choose to do that, that's the other thing. Hey, thanks for being with us tonight. Want to remind you as well, if you want to be a part of the team, you can come and join us on our Patreon, patreon.com/Big Hairy News. Great time to jump aboard and be a part of who we are, because I think the next round of donations comes out in 3 or 4 days. So if you like what we do and you want to support what we do and help us pay a few bills, then feel free to jump on board and be a part of the team. And while we're here, let's just say thank you to Fiona Sullivan, who is our latest patron. We threw this idea out there a month or so ago that we might try and get to 50 patrons by Christmas. Look, realistically, I don't think that's going to happen, which is fine. We'll just do what we do. We're about 30 at the moment, I think. But if you've ever considered supporting what we do, if you like what we do, then we'd love to have you on board as a patron. We have at least once a month, we have a monthly get together. And I think what we're going to do next week, although no one, I'm offended that no one brought up my beautiful looking half deck that I completed in the weekend. One of the reasons I'm doing this is because probably in 2 weekends time, we're going to have a BHN barbecue, and Chewy and his partner, George and his partner, hopefully Jason. You guys don't know Jason, but Jason is someone who's done all the technical stuff behind, helps out a lot when there's a technical glitch, and his partner will all come around and we'll fire up the barbie for the first time on the new deck. And I think we will have our monthly meeting that month, which will be in a couple of weeks' time, which will be the December one, during that barbecue. So do it on the phone, do it during the barbecue, and let you join into the BHN Christmas party, if that's indeed what it is. So, yep, if you're interested, you want to be involved, you want to be a part of the BHN Christmas party, albeit virtually, although, I'll fire you a snag, then patreon.com/Big Hairy News is how you can get on board. There's 7 levels, as little as $5 a month, up to $250 a month, and everything in between. Merchandise starts kicking in at about the $50, I think, level. And would love to have you on board to help us continuing to do what we're doing. The other thing I guess to tell you is we're probably going to we are stopping over Christmas. Our last show will probably be in the week before Christmas, either the Monday, Tuesday, or the Wednesday. And I am doing some work for Today FM through summer. So we'll probably end up picking up again in the middle of January, would be my guess. But we'll obviously keep you up to date as to what we're doing when we're doing it. And the best way to find out what we're doing is probably to follow me on Twitter, and I'll keep you up to date with what happens on there then. All right, team. Thanks for being with us tonight. Appreciate you. Appreciate the fuck out of you. If you're listening to us on the audio podcast, thanks for doing that. Make sure if you're on Apple Podcasts in particular, you like us and review us. Good to get the algorithm helped out there a little bit. And other than that, we will catch you again tomorrow night from 10 p.m. for another edition of Big Hairy News. Stay safe and catch you then. Hooroo.